Rarity groaned a little as she turned over in the bed. She had been sick for so long she couldn't remember. It wasn't terrible. She still had her knitting. Thankfully, she was a unicorn, so she could keep herself busy. Though her work wasn't runway worthy any longer, it was still warm. She would send Applejack into town to give away any clothes she'd finished. And this was the highlight of any week, when she got to finish another sweater or some such, and hear about how some young fool had something nice to wear now. But the highlight of her days was about to happen. Rarity smiled as the door opened, as she knew who it would be. Applejack stepped into the room and looked as radiant as she had ever been, though Rarity wasn't sure how Applejack had weathered the years so very well. It looked as though she were younger by half a decade, and some change. But it didn't matter to Rarity. Her kindness, care, and love that was ever flowing from her mate was the most important part of her life. "Hello, darling." Rarity shifted up slightly so she could look Applejack in the eyes. Applejack smiled in return, walking over to her bedside and depositing a vase newly filled with flowers. "Good morning, Rarity. How are you feeling?" Rarity absolutely beamed at the flowers, staring at them for long moments. "Oh, darling, they are so beautiful, and I am doing well this morning." Her smile brightened as she looked back at Applejack. "Do you have a busy day ahead of you?" Applejack nodded her head slightly. "Yes, we have lots of apples to pick. It'll be a bumper crop this year for certain." Rarity nodded, about to go back to staring at her new flowers, before she gasped loudly, "Applejack, where is your hat?" There was a long, pregnant pause between the two. Applejack just smiled and shook her head. "I left it up on the hill. Don't worry though, I'll be going out there right after I'm done visiting you."
"Goodness, you had me worried there, Applejack."
She settled back into the pillows on her bed.
"You know I made you that hat?"
Applejack nodded with a slight chuckle. "Yes, I know."
"Oh dear, have I already told you this story?" "Oh, wait, no. You were there, weren't you, dear? I'm sorry. I know It's harder for me to... It's..."
Rarity trailed off, huffing slightly.
What were we talking about, darling? I forget."
Applejack patted Rarity's hoof gently. "You were telling me about the Stetson." Rarity nodded hesitantly. She was fairly certain she'd told Applejack the story before. Should she tell it again?
"Darling, haven't I told you this story before?"
Applejack nodded and smiled. "Yes, you have. But tell it again. You like telling it." Sitting down and watching intently, Applejack seemed ready to listen. Shaking her head, Rarity couldn't help but chuckle.
"Oh no, darling. We can save one of my repeated stories for a cold evening when you don't have work to be doing, can't we?"
Applejack chuckled in response and nodded. "Of course. You won't be going anywhere until you tell me that story again." Rarity giggled a bit.
"You should tell me a story then too."
"What story do you want to hear, Rarity?" Rarity flushed gently. She always gave the same answer, even before she had started to forget things, and now even more so.
"What about how you fell in love with me?"
Applejack chuckled and shook her head. "That story takes hours to properly tell. And as you said, I do have work to do out there. Lots of apples to buck." Rarity let out a small bark of laughter herself, sticking her tongue out at the other pony.
Oh, sure. I use it as an excuse, so you just have to do the same.
She tilted her head slightly.
Fine. Perhaps we can tell each other stories this evening then, when you're done with work.
Applejack nodded in response, holding up a hoof. I promise. Before she moved her hoof over her eyes. Pinky promise. So you know I'm telling the truth. Rarity couldn't stop her frilled frame from rocking slightly with her laughter.
Darling, you're the element of honesty. You always tell the truth.
Rarity closed her eyes for a moment as Applejack turned to leave, deciding that perhaps a short nap before her knitting might be in order. She was so very tired recently she could barely complete a project a week. But it was still progress. It still helped. Her eyes snapped open before she could fall asleep though. Summoning her strength, she reached a hoof out towards Applejack.
Applejack?
Turning around, Applejack hurried back over. Shh, it's alright, Rarity. I'm here. Patting Rarity's hoof gently. Rarity looked to the side, eyeing the beautiful flowers she'd been brought. Taking a long moment to pick out the most beautiful rose from the bunch, she levitated it. Pausing for a moment so she could take a long, luxurious sniff of it, closing her eyes to enjoy the full scent of the rose. The memories it called up of Applejack giving her an entire bouquet on their first date. Then she opened her eyes, continuing the rose on its journey over to Applejack.
For my love.
Applejack paused for a moment before gingerly taking the rose in her mouth, nodding. Thank you, Rarity. I know just where to put this. Applebloom walked up the short hill near the farmhouse, approaching the small family cemetery that the apples kept there. Past the older gravestones for Bright Mac and Pear Butter, past the one for Granny Smith, and stopping at the newest grave. Looking up at the heavens, she smiled gently.
Don't worry, sis. I'll keep looking after her till she catches up to you.
Laying the rose that Rarity had given her earlier down in front of the gravestone, leaving Rarity's gift for her love. For her love.
Support me on Patreon. Subscribe and make sure to ring that notification bell to know when I post new content. And please, feel free to join the Lotus Garden. Links in the description. Thanks for listening, and look forward to more. Good night, every pony.